In the early hours of a cold, grey morning, long before the Italian sun rose over the battered hills and ruined villages of Europe, the men of the United States Army Air Forces stood in silence beside their aircraft, breathing in the metallic scent of oil, fuel, and destiny. They had been summoned not for a routine mission, not for a simple bombing run, but for an operation that would demand everything they had: courage, precision, sacrifice, and a willingness to leave everything behind in the sky above enemy territory. This was the morning the USAF would attempt something that war strategists whispered about with a mixture of awe and disbelief. This was the day the United States would try to silence the entire German Air Force in one single, perfectly coordinated strike. And the men getting ready to fly knew that if they failed, they might never return home. But if they succeeded, they would change the course of the war in a single day. The airfield was alive with motion. Ground crews rushed between rows of bombers, tightening bolts, checking flaps, securing payloads, and wiping sweat from their foreheads despite the bitter cold. Engines roared to life, one by one, vibrating through the concrete, shaking every bone in the men standing near them. The bomber crews moved with quiet determination, their boots crunching over frost-covered ground, their eyes fixed on the task ahead. They didn't joke, they didn't shout, they didn't brag. They moved with the solemn focus of men who understood that history was about to call their name. The message for the mission had been delivered the night before. Pilots, navigators, gunners, bombardiers, and radio operators sat in the dim briefing room with their hearts thundering as the commander of the base revealed the words that would echo in their memories for the rest of their lives. Gentlemen, tomorrow morning, the United States Army Air Forces will strike the heart of the German Luftwaffe. Not one base, not one run, all of it. We will hit their airfields, their fuel depots, their assembly factories, their runways, their repair centers, their reserves, their control towers. Every asset they rely on. Every place where a German aircraft sleeps. Tomorrow, the Luftwaffe will wake up to find itself under attack from every direction. And if we do our job well, if we do it right, they will never recover. The room had fallen into stunned silence. No one moved. No one breathed. The enormity of what was being asked settled over them like a weight across their shoulders. But beneath the shock was something else. Something fierce and powerful. It burned in their eyes, tightened their fists, and steadied their breath. It was pride, because they were the ones chosen for this. They were the ones the world trusted to strike the blow that could cripple the enemy. And in that moment, each man made peace with whatever outcome awaited him. As the bombers lined up on the runway in the freezing pre-dawn darkness, the clouds above them glowed with faint streaks of red and orange, as though morning itself understood the significance of what was about to happen. The pilots climbed into their cockpits, adjusting oxygen masks, checking instruments, and exchanging final nods with their crew. Gunners took their positions, gripping cold metal handles, scanning the skies that would soon be filled with fire. The engines roared louder, shaking the airfield with a deep rolling thunder that carried across the farmland. And then the first B-17 began to roll. It accelerated down the runway, its massive frame trembling with the effort of lifting itself into the air. The wheels left the ground. The bomber rose steadily, climbing into the dark, vast sky. One by one, dozens of others followed. Then, hundreds. The sound of their engines merged into a colossal roar that vibrated through the earth like an approaching storm. Civilians miles away woke up in fear, thinking the world was ending. German intelligence stations monitored the signal with growing alarm, unsure of what the Americans were planning. And deep inside occupied Europe, German pilots slept peacefully in their bunks, still unaware that the sky was about to turn into a battlefield that would swallow their air force whole. As the American formation stretched across the heavens, filling the sky with wings from horizon to horizon, there was something almost mythic about the sight. These were not just aircraft. They were symbols of industrial might, courage, and the unwavering determination of a nation that had decided enough was enough. The USAF was not just coming to fight. It was coming to end a chapter of the war. It was coming to deliver a blow so devastating that the Luftwaffe would take decades to recover, if it ever did. Inside the lead bomber, the tension was razor sharp. The pilot kept his eyes locked ahead, scanning the horizon. The navigator's voice cracked over the intercom, giving bearings and coordinates with steady precision. The radio operator monitored encrypted transmissions, relaying updates from other wings of the operation. The bombardier adjusted his scope, checking wind direction and calculating the exact timing of release. No one dared speak unless necessary. Every man understood that one mistake could collapse the entire mission. They crossed into enemy territory just as the sun began to rise. The sky turned gold and crimson, lighting up the bombers like floating steel temples. The German civilians below looked up in terror. It was not one squadron overhead. It was not 10. It was hundreds. They had never seen the American Air Force mobilize like this. Panic spread through the towns as people raced to shelters. Bells rang out warnings, and anti-aircraft crews sprinted to their guns. But by the time the first German gun opened fire, the Americans were already past the point of no return. The mission had begun. The bombers split into waves, each formation peeling off toward its designated target. Some headed toward massive airfields packed with German fighters, others toward fuel depots that supplied the Luftwaffe with life, others toward factories that produced vital aircraft parts. And then the sky erupted. Explosions bloomed across German air bases like thunder tearing through the earth. Bombs fell in steady, calculated waves, striking runways, hangars, barracks, storage sites. Aircraft lined up wing to wing. Flames shot into the sky. German planes attempted to scramble, but were destroyed before their wheels even lifted off the ground. Pilots raced to their cockpits in desperation, shouting orders, but smoke and chaos swallowed them. Some aircraft tried to flee the inferno, only to be met by American escort fighters waiting like hawks in the clouds. The American fighters dove with savage efficiency. P-51 Mustangs streaked through the air, leaving trails of pure fire as they shredded German aircraft fleeing the airfields. P-109s and FW-190s, proud symbols of German air power, were torn from the sky before they could even form proper defensive lines. The escort fighters worked with ruthless coordination, making sure no German pilot escaped. Every time a German aircraft tried to climb, an American wing was already there to cut it down. Meanwhile, bombers devastated the ground infrastructure. Oil tanks exploded in towering pillars of flame. Factories collapsed in burning heaps. Ammunition stores ignited in violent chain reactions that shook the earth for miles. German mechanics, officers and supply crews ran for their lives through the inferno, desperately trying to salvage what they could. But there was no controlling the storm above them. It was too precise, too overwhelming, too absolute. This was not a raid. It was an execution. Across multiple airfields, German aircraft lay burning, shattered or buried under rubble. Entire squadrons were erased. Command towers were obliterated. Fuel reserves went up in fireballs so large they turned the sky black. The German Air Force, once feared, once admired, once considered unstoppable, was being dismantled piece by piece in a single morning. And the USAF showed no sign of slowing. Wave after wave continued to arrive, each one adding another layer of destruction. German anti-aircraft crews fired desperately, managing to hit a few bombers, but the sheer number of American aircraft denied them any real hope of stopping the assault. Even as smoke from earlier bombing runs filled the sky, new formations emerged through the haze like steel ghosts. They came relentlessly, without pause, without mercy. It was at this moment that German pilots, finally airborne, attempted to engage. But they were disorganized, scattered, and facing an opponent with complete control of the air. Those who climbed high enough to intercept the bombers found the Mustangs waiting for them. Those who tried to flee towards safer airspace were chased down. Many never even saw the enemy that shot them from the sky. And as the battle raged overhead, a realization spread through the German ranks like poison. The Luftwaffe was collapsing. Their planes were burning, their bases were destroyed, their fuel was gone, their reserves were crippled, their pilots were dying before they even reached altitude. By midday, the truth was undeniable. The USAF had done the impossible. In a single operation, across a single morning, They had silenced the German Air Force, and the world would never be the same. The smoke rising from the shattered German airfields twisted upward into the sky like dark serpents, curling and writhing against the cold blue morning as if trying to escape the destruction below. But nothing could escape. Not the flames that devoured the Luftwaffe's lifeblood. Not the cries of desperate ground crews sprinting between burning aircraft. Not the crumbling faith of a regime that had once believed the German Air Force was invincible. And not the stunned disbelief of German civilians who watched the inferno consume everything they had been told would protect them. What they saw that day was not a raid, not an attack, not a battle. It was annihilation delivered with surgical precision by a force so overwhelming, so disciplined, and so relentless that it appeared almost supernatural. For the American crews who flew above the destruction, the sight below was both terrifying and strangely silent, almost peaceful in its finality. They watched entire squadrons burn, hangars collapse, and fuel tanks erupt like dying stars. But none of them felt triumph. The weight of what they were doing pressed heavily on them. They knew this day would be recorded in history, not merely as a tactical victory, but as a moment when one air force extinguished another. The mission was far from over. Anti-aircraft batteries that had been caught off guard during the early morning chaos were now manned, armed, and desperate. Flak bursts exploded in thick black clouds around the American bombers, shaking their fuselages and rattling every bolt inside. Shrapnel tore through wings, sparks flew from propellers, a gunner cried out as shards of metal cut through his shoulder. But the formation did not break. The bombers pushed forward through the storm of fire with the determination of men who understood why they were there. Behind them, escort fighters danced through the sky like angry hornets, diving at flak towers, machine-gunning trucks carrying reinforcements, and disrupting any attempt by the Germans to mount a coordinated counterattack. The Luftwaffe was scrambling what few aircraft they had left, but their situation was hopeless. German pilots raced to their planes only to find them engulfed in flames. Others climbed into cockpits as bombs detonated across the runway. Those who managed to take off faced a sky dominated by Mustangs, Lightnings, and Thunderbolts, American hunters who refused to give them even a moment of breathing room. Inside one B-17, the crew fought not just the enemy, but the fear creeping through their veins. The plane shuddered with every flak burst, metal groaning under the strain. The bombardier lay flat against his scope, sweat dripping across his forehead as he lined up the target. The pilot gripped the controls, adjusting altitude with practiced movements. The gunners barked warnings into the intercom as enemy fighters attempted reckless climbs into the formation before being torn apart by American escorts. The radio operator received frantic messages from other planes, engines failing, oil pressure dropping, fires spreading across wings. But the formation held. And when the bombardier finally released the payload, the bombs fell with deadly accuracy, slamming into the remaining hangars, wrenching apart warehouses full of aircraft parts, igniting fuel trucks, and closing the last functioning runway for miles. The German airfields, once symbols of power, were reduced to smoldering skeletons. As the second wave finished their run, the third wave approached, fresh aircraft, newly armed, ready to deliver the final blow. By now, the German response had turned from resistance to desperation. Their command posts were in chaos. Radios crackled with panicked voices. Officers screamed orders that no one could follow. Mechanics tried to move undamaged aircraft into shelters, but the shelters were already crumbling. Pilots tried to coordinate a defense, but their formations were shredded before they even reached altitude. The Luftwaffe was not merely losing, it was dying. The third wave of American bombers did what the first two had begun. They extinguished the last sparks of the Luftwaffe's operational capability. They cratered runways so deeply that no aircraft could land or take off. They flattened remaining reserve hangars. They destroyed radar stations, anti-aircraft command posts, fuel reserves, ammunition depots, and maintenance yards. When they turned away, there was nothing left to bomb. Below, German soldiers stared at the sky in numb defeat. The smoke clung to their uniforms, their boots sank into mud, mixed with oil, blood, and debris. They watched helplessly as American bombers disappeared into the horizon, replaced immediately by fresh formations still arriving. It seemed impossible. Where were they all coming from? How could the Americans have so many planes? How could they coordinate such an overwhelming assault with such precision? German propaganda had always painted the United States as disorganized, untested, lacking discipline. But the sky above them told a different story. The Americans were efficient, they were determined, they were merciless when necessary, and they had resources on a scale Germany could not imagine. On the ground, civilians emerged from their shelters only when the attack finally began to ease. What they saw stunned them. The airfields that once represented the pride of the Reich now lay in ruins. Entire wings of aircraft destroyed, entire rows of hangars gone. The runway obliterated. Officers wandered aimlessly through the destruction, unable to process how quickly the tide had turned. Some civilians sobbed, others cursed. But most simply stood in silent shock, realizing that the war had shifted in a single morning. Meanwhile, the American bombers began their long flight home. Many were damaged, trailing smoke, engines sputtering, fuselages riddled with holes. Some limped along at dangerously low altitude, hoping to reach friendly lines. Others dropped out of formation, unable to keep pace. But the crews did not abandon each other. Escort fighters circled wounded bombers like guardians, ensuring they were never left vulnerable. If a bomber struggled, fighters descended to protect it. If a plane fell out of formation, the others shifted to compensate. It was a ballet of loyalty, courage, and precision. Inside one battered B-24, the pilot fought to keep his aircraft aloft. 2 engines were gone. A third was failing. The plane shook violently with every gust of wind. The co-pilot muttered prayers under his breath. The navigator bled from a cut across his forehead but continued calling out bearings. The tail gunner stared at the horizon, keeping watch despite the pain in his ribs from being slammed against the gun mount. They refused to give up. They refused to die. And when they finally saw the English coastline through the smoke and frost, a cheer rose inside the cabin. A ragged, exhausted cheer that carried the weight of survival. On the ground back at the airfield, medics waited with stretchers. Ground crews prepared fire suppression equipment. Officers watched the horizon with binoculars, counting the returning planes, their hearts breaking with every aircraft that failed to appear. The first bomber touched down, skidding across the runway with sparks flying from its damaged landing gear. The second landed hard, one wing nearly scraping the ground. The third limped in, smoking from every engine, and then more and more and more. Some landed barely intact, some landed on fire. Some crashed upon touching the ground. But they came home. They came home from a mission no one believed possible. The men who stepped out of the bombers staggered from exhaustion, their faces blackened by smoke, their uniforms torn, their bodies trembling. Doctors rushed forward, officers embraced their crews. Ground personnel clapped, shouted, cried. These were not just airmen. They were heroes, men who had flown straight into the heart of the enemy and emerged through fire and fury, carrying the weight of victory on their shoulders. And then the reports arrived. Every airfield struck had been crippled. Every target had been hit. The Luftwaffe's operational strength had collapsed. Their fighters destroyed, their runways unusable, their fuel reserves gone, their response capacity shattered. It was the most devastating single-day blow the German Air Force had ever suffered. And the men of the USAF had delivered it. For the first time in the war, German commanders whispered a truth they had never considered possible. The era of Luftwaffe dominance was over. The Americans had not only taken the skies, they owned them. And from that day forward, nothing would ever be the same. What the world witnessed that morning was not just an operation. It was the moment the USAF proved that when America commits its full power to a mission, nothing, not even the mightiest air force in Europe, can stand in its way. In the days that followed the devastating operation, the German High Command searched desperately for explanations that did not exist. They interrogated surviving pilots, demanded reports from every airfield, summoned engineers, mechanics, intelligence officers, anyone who might offer a theory as to how the United States had crippled the Luftwaffe in a single morning. but the answers were always the same. The Americans had arrived in numbers Germany could not match. Their timing had been flawless. Their coordination had been unlike anything the European theater had ever seen. And their determination, cold, ruthless, absolute, had broken the spine of German air power in a way that no one believed possible. The German Air Force, once considered the most formidable in the world, had not been defeated gradually. It had been silenced abruptly, violently, and completely. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the news began to spread through American newspapers, radio broadcasts, and military reports. At first, the public only heard fragments, rumors of an enormous operation, claims that the USAF had struck deep into enemy territory, whispers that something unprecedented had taken place in the skies over Europe. Then the official confirmations arrived. Reports poured into military headquarters describing the destruction of dozens of airfields, hundreds of aircraft, and the collapse of the Luftwaffe's operational capacity. Historians would later call it the moment the war shifted irreversibly in the Allies' favor. But for the American people, the meaning was simpler and more profound. Their sons had done the impossible. They had flown into the heart of danger and emerged victorious. They had changed the world. Inside the bomber bases, the atmosphere was a mixture of grief and pride. Rows of aircraft stood silent on the tarmac, many damaged, some barely holding together. Mechanics worked tirelessly to repair what could be saved. The wounded were evacuated, the dead were honored, and the men who had survived walked among their comrades with the haunted, quiet look of soldiers who had seen hell and lived to tell about it. No one bragged, no one celebrated loudly. They spoke in hushed tones, recalling moments of terror, flashes of courage, near misses that still made their hands tremble. And every conversation circled back to the same truth. They had succeeded because they had never lost faith in each other. One crew, still covered in dried blood and soot, stood beside what remained of their bomber, a wreck of twisted metal barely recognizable as a flying machine. Their pilot, who had flown the final hour with 2 engines dead and controls barely responding, stared at the shattered cockpit window where shrapnel had nearly taken his life. His co-pilot had saved him by jerking the yoke at the last possible second. The navigator had guided them through smoke, so thick it blinded the instruments. The waist gunner had kept firing long after he ran out of ammunition, refusing to let German fighters slip past him. And yet, when journalists asked them how they felt, the pilot simply replied, "We did our job, that's all." But his eyes betrayed the truth. He knew they had done much more than their job. They had helped rewrite the fate of the war. Even as the Americans repaired their aircraft and tended to their wounded, German reconnaissance was already confirming the scale of the destruction. Entire wings of fighters were gone. Repair facilities were pulverized. Fuel reserves were destroyed. Luftwaffe commanders realized they could not assemble more than a handful of aircraft for days, possibly weeks. Their pilots, once feared across Europe, were now grounded, helpless, and forced to watch their skies be taken from them. For the first time since the start of the war, Germany understood that air superiority was no longer a contested prize. It belonged to America. Across Europe, Allied forces felt the shift immediately. Bombers that once needed heavy escort could now operate with increased freedom. Supply drops reached their targets safely. Fighter sweeps pushed deeper into enemy territory. Even the morale of soldiers on the ground changed. They looked up at the sky and saw not danger, but protection, a vast shield of American might that followed them like a guardian. One British infantryman later wrote in his journal, "We heard the sound of American bombers overhead and knew we were safe. The Germans no longer owned the sky. We did." Back in Germany, Hitler raged. He demanded explanations. He accused his generals of incompetence. He lashed out at his officers, screaming about betrayal, cowardice, and failure. But no fury, no threat, no punishment could undo what had happened. The Luftwaffe was crippled, and the Americans were responsible. The regime tried to rewrite the narrative, claiming the damage was minimal, but the truth was undeniable. Every German city could see the rising smoke. Every surviving pilot could feel the weight of the loss. And every civilian who had once believed in the invincibility of the Reich now felt a creeping dread settle into their bones. Meanwhile, American crews prepared for the possibility of follow-up missions. They knew the Luftwaffe might attempt a last-ditch recovery. They knew the enemy would rebuild whatever they could. And they knew the war was far from over. But something inside them had changed. They felt a surge of confidence that had not existed before. They had flown through storms of flak, through walls of fire, through swarms of enemy fighters, and emerged victorious. They were no longer just airmen. They were architects of history. As night settled over the American airfields, the men gathered together quietly, some writing letters home, others cleaning their equipment in silence, a few staring at the stars through smoke-stained windows. The enormity of what they had done weighed heavily on them, but so did the pride that came with it. They knew that their mission would be studied for generations, that their courage would become legend, that their sacrifices would help free millions. But in that moment, all they wanted was rest. The next morning, commanders assembled the surviving crews for an official briefing. The room fell silent as maps were laid out, photographs displayed, statistics read aloud. Fuel depots destroyed, airfields ruined, aircraft lost beyond replacement, radar stations gone, factories obliterated, communications centers shattered. And finally, the words that sent a quiet electricity through the hearts of every man in the room. Gentlemen, the Luftwaffe can no longer challenge us. The skies belong to the United States. There was no cheering, no applause, just a deep collective breath, a release of tension that had been building for years. They had done something impossible. They had struck a blow so powerful that even Nazi propaganda could not deny it. And soon, the world would feel the effects. From that day forward, Allied bombers roamed the skies with unprecedented freedom, targeting factories, railways, bridges, and fortifications with increasing accuracy. The German war machine, once fed by a complex network of supply lines and industrial centers, began to starve. And every success that followed traced its origins back to the moment the USAF silenced the German Air Force. For the American people, the story became a symbol of what their nation could achieve when united. Newspapers printed photographs of returning crews, their faces weary but proud. Families gathered around radios, listening to broadcasts that described the victory in reverent tones. Children played in the streets, pretending to pilot bombers across imaginary battlefields. And across the country, citizens felt a renewed surge of patriotism, a belief that their sacrifices at home, rationing, saving, working long hours had meaning. For the men who flew the mission, the memories would stay with them forever. They would remember the sound of engines roaring in unison, the glow of dawn spreading across formation wings, the violent bursts of flak tearing through the sky, the smell of burning fuel, the sight of enemy airfields collapsing beneath them, the terror of being hit, the relief of surviving, the grief of seeing empty seats in the mess hall, and above all, the knowledge that they had helped save the world from tyranny. Years later, historians would write volumes about the operation. They would analyze every detail, the planning, the execution, the aftermath. They would marvel at the coordination, the bravery, the technological innovation, the sheer scale of the assault. They would call it one of the most decisive air operations in history. But none of their words could fully capture what it felt like to be there, to be inside a shaking bomber as anti-aircraft fire exploded around you, to hear the crackle of gunfire from escort fighters, to see flames erupt across enemy runways, to feel the raw force of history unfolding beneath your wings. Only the men who flew that day truly understood. And as the war continued to shift, as the Allies advanced across Europe, as the German war machine crumbled piece by piece, every soldier, every pilot, every commander knew one truth that echoed through the halls of military history. The day the USAF silenced the German Air Force was the day the tide of the war turned for good. It was not chance. It was not luck. It was the courage of men who faced impossible odds and refused to back down. Men who flew into fire and came out legends. Men who proved that when America rises as one, no enemy can withstand its power. And the world would never forget it. In the months that followed the operation, something remarkable began to spread across Europe. Not through whispered rumors or intercepted radio transmissions, but through the unmistakable quiet that settled over the skies. German troops on the front lines stared upward, expecting to hear the familiar growl of Luftwaffe engines. But the sky remained empty. Civilians in occupied towns looked at the clouds, waiting for German patrols, but the air stayed still. Even Allied soldiers marching across ravaged landscapes paused occasionally to glance upward, stunned by the silence, realizing that they were witnessing a turning point so profound that even nature seemed to acknowledge it. The Luftwaffe, the once feared beast that had dominated Europe in the earliest days of the war, was gone. Not weakened, not delayed, not hindered. Gone. And every man who served on the ground knew exactly who had done it. The American airmen, the crews who had flown through fire and darkness, had delivered a blow so devastating that the sky itself had changed. There was no need to argue, no need for propaganda, no need for debate. Every soldier, every civilian, every commander understood the truth. The German Air Force had been silenced in a single operation, and its absence reshaped the war. The Allies moved with a boldness they had never known before. Bombers launched daily, striking factories, bridges, supply lines, and convoys with unparalleled accuracy. Fighters roamed the skies like wolves, patrolling every inch of contested territory with ruthless efficiency. The Americans were no longer fighting for air superiority, they owned it. And with that power came a momentum the Germans could not stop. Entire divisions advanced across France and Italy without the fear of sudden Luftwaffe strikes. Supply convoys moved through previously dangerous routes with newfound confidence. Tanks rolled through villages without having to look skyward for threats. The ground war accelerated. The Allied advance grew stronger by the hour, and the German command, once so confident in their air power, saw their entire strategy collapse like a crumbling fortress. Inside the German high command, arguments erupted constantly. Some officers claimed the Americans had used new technology. Others insisted there must have been espionage. Some argued that the Luftwaffe had been sabotaged from within, but none of these theories mattered. The truth was simple and humiliating. The United States had outproduced, outplanned, and outfought them. The German pilots who had once terrorized Europe were grounded, helpless, forced to listen to the distant roar of Allied bombers as they destroyed one strategic target after another. And nothing they did could change it. They could not rebuild fast enough. They could not train pilots fast enough. They could not repair enough runways. They could not import enough fuel. Every morning, they woke to a sky filled with American engines. Every night, they went to sleep, knowing the next sunrise would bring more destruction. The German Air Force had not been defeated in a battle. It had been erased from the world's most important theater of war. Meanwhile, in the United States, the operation became a source of national pride that echoed from coast to coast. Newspaper headlines praised the courage of the airmen. Radio announcers spoke of the mission with reverence. Families gathered around their living rooms to hear the latest updates, holding on to every detail as if each word were a sacred piece of history. The nation understood what had happened. They understood that their sons had taken on the impossible and triumphed. They understood that the war effort, the rationing, the long work hours, the sacrifices made in every household, had meaning. Mothers cried tears of pride. Fathers read the stories aloud to their children. Veterans nodded silently, knowing the weight of such a victory. And across the entire country, one sentiment rose above all. America had shown the world what it was capable of. For the men who had flown the mission, life returned to a strange rhythm. They repaired their aircraft, attended briefings, trained for future operations, and shared quiet meals in crowded mess halls. But something inside them had changed. They walked with a gravity that only those who have witnessed the extremes of life and death could carry. They had flown into the jaws of hell and returned. They had seen the world from a vantage point no one else could imagine. The sky filled with bombers stretching to the horizon, the earth below erupting in fire, the crackling bursts of anti-aircraft weapons exploding around them like thunder, the sight of enemy planes burning as they spiraled downward. These memories etched themselves into their minds, and no amount of silence could ever erase them. Many of them struggled with the weight of that day. They remembered the men who had not returned, empty bunks, empty seats in the briefing room. Voices they would never hear again. The operation had been a success beyond anything the Allied forces had dreamed of, but victory remained intertwined with the bittersweet cost of those who had given everything. Yet even in their grief, the airmen understood that their fallen brothers had not died in vain. Their sacrifice had saved thousands of lives, accelerated the end of the war, and protected millions of people from oppression. It became a source of strength, a reminder that freedom demanded courage, and that the price of peace could be measured in the bravery of those who were willing to face death so others could live. As the Allies tightened their grip across Europe, German soldiers began to speak openly of the shift. They wrote in their diaries, they whispered to each other in trenches, they confessed to their families in letters they hoped would reach home. They spoke of the day the American bombers came, the day when the sky turned black with wings, when the air vibrated with the roar of engines, when their airfields erupted in flames. They described the strike as apocalyptic, unstoppable, something beyond human. Some claimed the Americans must have used new secret weapons. Others said the Americans had been blessed by fate. But most simply admitted what they had been afraid to say for years. Their enemy had become stronger than they were. German superiority was gone. American might had replaced it, and nothing could reverse that change. In one destroyed airfield, a German mechanic stood among the charred remains of dozens of aircraft. He stared at the twisted metal, the blown-out windows, the scorched runways, and the shattered hangars that echoed the defeat of his entire nation. In his journal, he wrote a sentence that historians would later quote as one of the most haunting reflections of the war. On that day, we looked up and realized the sky no longer belonged to us. It belonged to America. That realization spread throughout the entire German military, eroding morale, weakening resolve, and sowing the seeds of inevitability. They could fight on the ground, but without the sky they were blind, vulnerable, and exposed. The Luftwaffe had been their sword and shield. Without it, they were a wounded nation, holding on to a war they could no longer win. As victory drew nearer, the American airmen who had helped change the fate of the world prepared for the final chapter. Some were assigned to new missions. Others were transferred to different bases. A few were allowed brief periods of rest, though none of them truly rested. Their minds lingered on the images of that day. The moment the bomb bay doors opened, the instant the flak exploded, the eerie silence after the last bomb fell, the sight of burning airfields stretching across the landscape. They replayed these scenes in their minds, not with pride, but with the solemnity of men who understood the weight of their actions. They had done what had to be done. They had helped free a continent. They had saved countless lives. But they had also witnessed destruction on a scale few could imagine. And yet, even with all they had endured, even with the memories that kept them awake at night, there was something unshakable inside them. Something that swelled in their chests each time they saw the American flag rising over the base at dawn. It was the knowledge that they had stood at the edge of history and refused to step back. They had been called to do the impossible, and they had delivered. They had proven that courage, discipline, and unity could overcome even the darkest forces of tyranny. And they had shown the world that when the United States commits itself fully to a cause, no enemy can withstand it. When the war finally ended, the men returned home as heroes. But most of them never claimed the title. They walked through train stations and airports with humble smiles, embracing families they feared they would never see again. They settled into quiet routines, working jobs, raising children, rebuilding lives. But deep inside, they carried the memory of the day that had defined their generation. Some shared stories with close friends, others stayed silent, but all of them knew the truth. The world would never fully understand what happened in the sky that day. Only those who were there could grasp its magnitude. Historians would spend decades analyzing the operation. They would debate the strategies, the timing, the logistics, the consequences. They would write books, record documentaries, deliver lectures. But no amount of study could capture the raw power of the moment. The roar of engines, the glow of dawn on formation wings, the thunder of bombs falling in perfect unison, the shockwave of fire erupting across German airfields. Only the men who had lived it carried that truth inside them. And as those men aged, their hair turning grey, their hands trembling slightly when they spoke, one thing remained unshakable: the pride they felt when recalling the mission that changed the course of the war. They never sought recognition, they never demanded gratitude, but in their hearts, they knew they had taken part in something extraordinary. They had been the instrument of liberation. They had been the hammer that shattered the enemy's most powerful weapon. They had been the embodiment of American resolve. And long after the smoke cleared, long after the last bomber had landed, long after the world had rebuilt itself from the ashes of war, one truth continued to echo across history. The day the USAF silenced the German Air Force in a single operation was not just a victory. It was a message to all nations, all tyrants, all enemies of freedom. When America rises, when it stands united, when its sons and daughters give everything they have, there is no force on earth that can stand against it.